This is Big Man Tyrone, and you're about to watch the MtG Cabal Cast with your hosts, Woad, Thirsty, and Reptar. Sub to us on all your podcast networks at MtG Cabal Cast and YouTube.
All right, guys, welcome to part 2 of our Reserve List Summer episode. I know what you're thinking, and yes, I have been wearing these clothes for the last week while I waited for us to record part 2. So today, we've got a little bit of a rundown. Last time we gave kind of an origin story of what happened in 2018, cited some cards that spiked then that we thought were kind of real. This time we're going to get into not necessarily fake spikes like we touched on at the end of the last episode with, Grim Feast, etc. But we're going to go with stuff that follows more of a cycle. Mm-hmm. And that cycle often does sync up with Reserve List Summer or whatever you want to call it.
Yep.
But some stuff that happens periodically, which is more of an informative, hey, when this calms down, this is something you can buy into for the next time this happens.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the cyclical thing was kind of interesting because we'd thought when we put these episodes together, we'd come up with some pretty clear examples of what happened in 2018, what happened in 2020, and we would kind of delineate between the two. And then as we were looking up some cards to show, because we were drawing conclusions from them, what we actually found was that something like Metalworker and Gilded Drake are actually this kind of cyclical spikes, and we'll show you each as we talk about them. First up, I just have Metalworker because it's here in my tab. And we see it in 2014, right before Khans of Tarkir. We see it again, and I'll really say it's around Eternal Masters in July of 2016. And we see it again in 2018, and then we're seeing the rise again in 2020. 2016 and 2018 we know is these kind of like reserve list or legacy staple kind of spikes. The Star City Tour was heavy into legacy in 2016, so we saw a lot of that pop. There were articles and murmurings around there that Underground Sea would be the first $400 or $500 dual land from Revised that we would ever see. And cards like Metalworker were not a pillar of the format, but if somebody played one against you, you shouldn't have been too surprised. But what we didn't expect was that it would hold so well between all of these.
The interesting thing to me, too, is that I assumed this was... Because I was aware that it was cyclical. I was aware periodically it spiked. But I remember the first spike being, as you said, back in 2014, was right before Eternal Weekend. And all of a sudden, people wanted to play shops.
Yep.
So I assumed it was similar to Power, and that it saw a little bit of an uptick every time around Eternal Weekend. But it was literally just the first spike. No other spikes have coincided with Eternal Weekend whatsoever. And that was, even being aware of the cycle, I wasn't aware of the timing of the cycle and how this happened. It seems like every year and a half, basically every 16, 18 months, it'll just tick up. And it was interesting for me to doing the research. We figured that out and said, oh, wait, this isn't quite what I thought it was. Okay, then.
Yeah, and you can kind of line some of these up too is in regards to why there's float. So when you look at the spike in 2015 to 2016, there is a little bit of a bump in 2016. Well, what happens? Well, we go back to Zendikar, and we get some Eldrazi. And they're not bad for EDH. Kozilek the Great Distortion, Ulamog the Ceaseless Hungerer, I believe Emrakul the Promise End is illegal in EDH. It's the other one, Aeon Sorin, that's banned. Yeah. These cards are eminently playable in EDH, and just because you're playing a mono brown deck, a heavy artifact-based deck where Metalworker is at its most powerful, doesn't mean you also don't want some of these unique effects. So that helps float these cards, or you can kind of see the stepwise increase from Oath of the Gatewatch, where we got Kozilek into EMA, float a little bit longer through Kaladesh and Aether Revolt, which is another heavy artifact set. Didn't really get a lot of help there. Trends back down, but then comes up in that spike that we talked about in our previous episode in the summer of 2018, shortly after Dominaria, basically as people were cashing out of Bitcoin and, FOMO kind of kicked in. And Metalworker is kind of a choice card where it's basically an EDH playable, but not an all-star. Gilded Drake, however, the next card we want to talk about, that sees at, we'll call them cyclical spikes now, is just that. It is an EDH powerhouse. It is an
The
all-star
card
in
is
this format.
incredible in the format.
I assume it's all over CEDH, and
It is.
it just wrecks house. It is a very interesting card because you can do very interesting things with it if you want to flicker it, whereby you
That
swap.
I have.
Yep, you swap Gilded Drake and the card your opponent has, and then you flicker Gilded Drake, and it comes back into play under your control because you're the owner of it, and then you get to swap these again, and the swap, as long as both targets are legal when the swap resolves, you swap permanently. There are no gives backsies unless it's a card like Homeward Path that returns all creatures
That
to
you
their own.
own, and then it's...
All creatures under control. And Gilded Drake is a rocket right now. This thing's headed to the moon. But we can see kind of in the nation state of the EDH format, when we really zoom in, that there is the same kind of stepwise spike, this kind of cyclical spike. It's not the same that we saw in Metalworker, because it really is only around Oath of the Gatewatch, EMA, that we see one spike, but there is a spike nonetheless, and that brings it from 18 to about 25. So we're talking an almost, say, 40% increase on the card overall.
Yeah.
And now it's just, gone. Whenever Gilded Drake pops up on stocks, it's never coming back. And it cards of this ilk. That's it. But it's not like Mana Crypt that they can just keep printing into the ground, right? That's the one that vault. One of them's good, the other one's not. For EDH. And so these are cyclical, and we've seen this across the board, and we're going to continue to see it. These cards might dip in price, like we saw a little bit with Metalworker when it didn't get a lot of great support. Gilded Drake has kind of wavered, and it might come down because the price is just, at this point, overinflated for the demand that exists. It's going to sate. Demand will be sated, and then that's it. The card will stagger and eventually fall back down. But if it tumbles far enough, we will see another spike back up, and it will be very prominent in this graph. And this kind of gives you the information that you need to say, okay, if this happens every 18, 24 months, what have you, we can see the cycle of reserveless spiking happening. What does that mean for me? What do I need to do to prepare myself, either as a seller or a buyer? And that gives you a lot of great information and tools at your disposal to get ahead of this in the winter and spring if you want to, because we can see this coming now. This is the third time something like this has happened, and you can expect that it will be format all-stars and format staples.
And that's something that we wanted to make sure we differentiated between episodes 1 and 2, is that, we gave examples of both in episode 1. We want to make sure that we're differentiating what all-stars are and what are duds, because there are cyclical cards that are still duds, such as Grim Feast. But, again, it goes back to playability. Metalworker is something that's eminently playable and similar to Gilded Drake. It's something that only gets better as more support is printed for it.
Exactly.
And that's, similar to when we pick cards like Collected Company. They're only making more efficient creatures, so inevitably that card will get better. Mm-hmm. And it's worth noting that EDH, especially Gilded Drake, shines because it's in the most popular, most powerful color, and everybody loves taking people's stuff.
Yeah.
That's just how it is.
It's brutally efficient for what it does, and I think that's what you need to look for every time this happens. You need to look for that efficiency that just can't be matched. And when we talk about Elkin Lair, which was a dud from the previous episode, and we talk about Grim Feast, a card that does have two halves to it, but has been outclassed by cards that contain only one half of Grim Feast.
Yeah.
It's things like that will hold back a number of these reserve list cards. It's the fact that there's just something better out there. It might cost a little bit more, but it does the same or better. It's not close. It wasn't close enough to get picked up by that functional reprint rule, because, like I said, it might be half of the effect.
Yeah.
Or it might be something different enough. But there is a lot of low power on the reserve list.
Yeah.
And it's very easy
such as
to
one
pick
of my
up.
pet cards, Stamping Field. Don't buy that card.
That's fair. That is fair.
But yeah, it's worth keeping in mind that if you want to be legitimate about what you're doing in finance,
Mm-hmm.
if you want these things to be something that not only you do as a hobby, but to get some type of extra cash one way or another, make sure you're paying attention to playability. FOMO is not the way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend of mine message me last week and was like, hey, all these reserve list cards are spiking. I want to buy out a $1 to $5 reserve list card that hasn't spiked yet. And I said, don't do that. That's a good way to light your money on fire.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't listen.
No, I want to bring up a good example of what I was talking about, where we have similar but different effects. There's a card that on the reserve list that's been recently spiking, and I'll bring it up. It's a white enchantment from Legends. It is called Lifeblood, and we can see around 2018 it just jumps from nothing to something. It's going to be about $25. 2 and 2 white. You gain 1 life point each time one of your opponent's mountains becomes tapped. Okay, well, when we have, is it Auriok Champion? No.
Core Firewalker, isn't it?
Is that the one that gains a life whenever somebody plays a red spell?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And has pro red.
Yeah. There are a number of other effects that do something similar or better than Lifeblood. And they are life gain, protection from red, and a trigger off of a red spell being played in these fashions. And you don't have to pay $20 for something like this. Lifeblood, low power card. There are creatures that do something the same or better. So this is what we're talking about. There are a lot of these effects that you can just find something better for cheaper. And that's kind of the telling sign that it's a trap. Literally a trap. The other half of what we wanted to talk about in this episode are cards that were targeted in 2018, saw no movement, but are seeing incredible spikes right now. And again, that was kind of where we ended the last episode, but we kind of very clearly have 2 examples here. One of them is a little muddled because of what the card does. The other one is a very clear example. The card that's a little muddy is Hellfire. Hellfire is one heckadoodle of a card. There's a lot of text on it that's been oracled, but basically all non-black creatures are destroyed, and Hellfire deals X plus 3 damage to you. X is the number of creatures placed in the graveyard, right? It costs 2 and 3 black, so it's this weird wrath effect. Hellfire has held a price tag for a fairly long time based solely on the art, the name, everything about the card that isn't the actual effect of the card. That's why it's muddy, but you can see in the stocks graph that was targeted in 2018, and what happened shortly thereafter, it just came back down to what the standard price is, because the card was targeted for an RL spike, nobody cares about it, and the card just kind of drops. It's coming back around now as a spike because it's part of the RL spike that we're seeing, but this is a card that was targeted and did nothing because the demand was only there based on everything about the... Yeah. Well, not just FOMO, but everything...
Sorry, the spike was based on FOMO.
Yeah.
The demand for the card was not based on old school, vintage, EDH,
exactly.
Whatever playability.
You could remove every piece of Magic-related parlance from that card, name, CMC, and text in the text box, and that card would still sell just based on the art alone. It's one of those cards. And you can cite it in some other spikes that we've seen recently for Therese Nielsen art, sure. But this just goes to show that if you try and FOMO force something on the other end of it, it's going to drop back down to what demand was there for.
Yeah.
So, muddy, yes. Targeted in 2018, yes. And what's going to happen in 2020 is it's just going to raise the floor back up to where it was. And the couple people that wanted to buy it are just going to be forced into it, and then it'll come back down again, and we'll move it effectively into cyclical.
Yep. And I think it's worth noting, too, that Hellfire specifically, if you look at the MTG stocks graph for low, this year, it actually reached a low point that was lower than its pre-spike price by 25%. So if you do get into a bad spec like this, do not fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
Get out. Because you may end up losing money on it. And it's better, lose more money, I should say. It's better to lose less money than to lose more. Just try to get something out of it, which is why, and I'm sure you'll agree, one of the things that I have always been a big proponent of is you don't make money by waiting for a card to spike. You make money by locking in your margins. If you see a card spiking, don't get greedy. Sell it into the spike. You want to make your margins so you can move on to something else.
Absolutely. The other card that we want to bring up that was targeted in 2018, saw no movement, and might fall under cyclical eventually, is Well of Knowledge. Or as one of my friends calls it, Not Cursed Scroll. Because the art is...
Not Cursed Scroll.
Yeah, similar enough. The colors are similar enough that at a glance, it looks like Cursed Scroll. So,
I still think it is sometimes when I see it in a binder. I'm like, oh, Cursed... Oh, never mind.
So we can see, again, after Dominaria, before M19, the same summer spike in 2018, it falls almost all the way back down to the dollar card that it was, and is coming right back around for another spike, though it looks like the average is tumbling way back down as FOMO sales kind of cool.
Yeah.
So this is... It's hard to say if this is on the heels of the RL target because we don't know when it's going to end. We don't know when people are going to be done making their moves on RL cards for legitimate or nefarious means. But this is a kind of card that is obviously going to be targeted, and if it tumbles back down, it just becomes a cyclical spike. And this is one of those, if you want to try and lock in margins, you absolutely can, but sitting on this card is just going to do nothing but tie up capital.
Yeah.
It's not going to pan out. We have the historics behind this. It did nothing until the first reserve list spike. And this is kind of the lesson we learn every time that something goes on with the reserve list, that people try and monkey around with the reserve list or monkey around with a group of cards based on artist or expectation of card type, expeditions, invocations, masterpieces. We just saw expeditions are getting a reprint, essentially. That breaks the mold.
We're also getting Time Spiral again?
Yeah. Old face artifacts are making a comeback. But
yeah, I'm dumb.
Chalice looks okay. I'll say that. And then,
I think Chalice looks good. I love Old Border. I love Starfoils. I hate that they're basically just taking the remastered sets from Arena and printing them in paper as a standard legal set.
I don't think it's standard legal. I think it's purely supplemental.
I thought it was. I don't know. There's so many announcements. Who knows?
I think the bottom of the... I don't have it on me to find. But we have our core set announcement for what's coming up next year. The 4 sets. Strixheim... how is it?
Harry Potter.
Yeah, I was going to say Vikings, Harry Potter, Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And Return to Innistrad split over 2 sets, which we'll talk about all this at a later date. That's all on top, so that my expectation was those are the 4 standard sets. And then
that makes sense, yeah.
Purely
the bottom is the supplementals.
Mm-hmm, exactly, and that's Time Spiral 2 and Modern Horizons 2. So for anybody who hadn't caught it yet, that's the product slate for next year. And we're getting Path to Exile, and I guess everything in Time Spiral 2 will have an Old Border version of it, and then there's and then Modern Horizons will have the Zendikar fetches in it.
Yeah. So
that purely tangent. Going back to Well of Knowledge, this is the kind of thing that if you want to hold a card, hold a bad word, if you want to buy into a cyclical spike, Well of Knowledge is an example of what can happen. You can buy into the cyclical spike in December or winter or to spring if you're in the northern hemisphere. You buy into that. You pick up cards you know are targeted, and then you just get ready and you just start listing them at the end of May for 1.5 to 2x what the current market is. And according to this, you'll be able to move them, and that's perfectly fine because you have a plan. You know what you're going to do. There are the historics here that proves this. It's fine. you're doing what you're doing. You're not the one that is trying to create a new market trend or try to corner based on something specific that has specific demand, like I was talking about earlier in regards to artists or moving in on expeditions because they're pseudo unreprintable. Same thing with invocations and masterpieces, when you could instead be moving your money somewhere else and churning there. You don't have to sit and hold as long.
And I think it's worth noting that this is, for me, I see the RL model as a completely separate business model from the like churn model, and that they don't coexist, and that for me it helps to look at them as two separate things. I don't cross financial streams or anything like that when I'm looking at it, because I think if you want to do the 1.5x, list it for when it gets there, you need to keep in mind that that's not, it either is or isn't your active business model. And if it's not your active business model, focus on the other one.
Yep.
And I think that a lot of people run into problems when they try to keep both going in the same bucket. And that's not something that I personally can keep track of well. So just as like a general pointer, I think some people may benefit from separating those two out as like how they're MTG financing or how they're being a finance bro, whatever
you want to call it.
You want to, yeah. Because I like the 1.5x. I do it myself. I think it's important to have, your stuff that you just sit on and put in a box and forget. That's where I found all those Grim Feasts that I sold on Facebook. Had no idea, but it happens.
Yeah. And now that we have these historics officially for a lot of this reserve list stuff, you can turn that into your finance model if that's what you want to do. And absolutely, and there's no harm, there's no foul in it, and because there is a proven track record, it becomes a legitimate business path. Like I said, the only time it becomes squirrely is when you're trying to force movement where there hasn't been movement before.
Yeah.
And if people want to take umbrage about this because it's the reserve list and the spikes, etc., etc., whatever. It doesn't matter. You can either partake in the reserve list or not. And if you don't, if you want to own a Gaia's Cradle and you don't think $1,000 is reasonable, you know what? You are also correct.
Yeah.
$1,000 for that cradle is most likely not reasonable. You have recognized the fact that price has been toyed with because we are currently in a spiking position. But at the same time, if you were to make outreach instead of just look for outlets for outcry, you'd be able to pick up that cradle at close to previous prices because, as you mentioned, once that cradle spikes to 600 to 1,000, you're going to get people who are like, shit, I need to pick it up. And the market is that, I need to get out of it. And they want to lock in their margins. So if it was 350 before the spike, asking at 450 if the price is 600 might get that card. You might not have to pay that much more of a premium. It's all about how you want to deal with the market in that regard, and how the people out there are looking to deal with their margins. When it hit 1,000, we heard across at least 2 or 3 different discords that run like internal promotions, people are removing cradles at pre-spike prices.
Yeah.
So every time somebody monkeys around with the reserve list, then we see these spikes. A lot of it's directed towards Facebook and TCG Player, but if there's something you need because, hey, you just didn't have the finances, and you finally do, and you've just been kind of dragging your feet on that, you can still buy those cards. It's not that difficult.
No, and it's, I think a lot of there's a lot of vilification that goes on around, obviously, the reserve list.
Yeah.
It's very divisive, whatever. At the end of the day, you are not entitled to any of this, and you are absolutely correct if you say that these prices are too high, because you make that decision for yourself. You're also absolutely correct if you think that $20,000 for a Beta Lotus is too low. Yeah. Absolutely.
The door swings both ways on these things. And it's just your decision to make the entire way through.
Yeah.
And how you want to deal with it. You can lean into it and make it a business model if you want. You can lean away and, move out of the reserve list, divest if you want to.
Yeah.
It's completely up to you. Now that we have the cyclical nature, everybody has been forewarned.
Yeah.
And
the information's out there.
Yep.
There's no reason not to be aware of it.
Absolutely. And every year, more people move into Magic, yes, but every year, more people are also able to buy a lot of nostalgia-based items. So you have to remember that everything's going to increase year over year. And again, you can lean in, you can lean away. Either is fine. The importance here, and the crux of this episode is really now the cyclical nature of the reserve list. We might see it tighten. We might see it move down. We mentioned like 18, 24 months is kind of what we were really seeing in terms of like the pillars of a format like EDH or Legacy spike a lot earlier than those that are kind of dragging. Well of Knowledge, which we just cited. Underground Sea, we cited as kind of the marker in the first episode. You can do that. We might see things tighten down, and we might see 12 months and 18 are now your windows where things really start to move. And you just need to keep an eye out on that, because this becomes more of a collectible market every year. And embrace it.
Yeah.
If you want to own at least one reserve list card, pick whatever one you want, and it'll probably get out at a profit in the next couple of years.
Grim Feast. Don't pick Grim Feast.
Alkin Cove or whatever it is. You can still pick that one up for like layer for like $2 or $3. Yeah, why not? There is still a lot of low-hanging fruit on the reserve list. There's definitely money to be made. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to use the term because it's kind of pejorative when used incorrectly, but I mean, if you want to slumlord it on the reserve list, you absolutely can. And like I said, this is the second time these cards will have spiked. We're now moving into cyclical territory, so you're going to be going to be able to cash out at a profit at some point in time.
Worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. If that's what you want to do with your margins, you're fine with an ROI of between 12 and 24 months on something like that. Yeah, go for it. You can throw.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, if you can spare the $100, why not? I have $100 in Dogecoin. I bought it a
Always
number.
Trust the meme. Always trust the meme.
Don't let your dreams be memes. Or no, memes be dreams. I can never remember that quote.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter. If Dogecoin ever hits $1, I'm cashing out at like 8 figures. That's all I know.
Yeah, obviously.
Parts of a part of a part of a penny to buy in. Why the hell not?
Yeah.
Yeah, but consider it a low risk stock now that we're in the cyclical nature, the cyclical territory of the reserve list.
Yeah.
But getting out of that and pulling back to our actual picks, unless there's some more stuff you want to go over. All right.
Pick it up.
Okay. So I'll start mine first. I appreciate the Scott reference though. My pick for this is Rox Face Bender. And it's an interesting card if you look at it financially. I mean, the text on the card is also interesting. It's just kind of been a rope, and it dips down around Jumpstart and comes back. We're finally starting to see movement on it again, which is why I picked the card. As mentioned, Jumpstart printing, there's the M13 printing, and that's it for this card. That is the entire population of Rox Face Bender right now, those two sets. So, Rox Face Bender, CK was buying 16 copies about a month and a half ago. When I checked in the other for about $2. When I checked in the other day, they're now buying 42 copies at $2.05. The TCG market on these has gone up by about 50 cents to about $5.30, and there's just been a continual drop in population across the board. There are 145 unique prices total, which is not a lot for M13 for this card. As I did mention, Jumpstart did delay the price increase of this card, and if we ever get the rest of the Jumpstart population of cards that we are expected to, then we're probably going to see another delay in the financial gains of this card, and I'll address that later. But it is a little tenuous with that set. There are a lot of cards that are either going to hold or skyrocket based on what happens with our next wave of actual allocation of Jumpstart. This will be one of them. So, Rox... What you got?
Nightmare. Jumpstart is a disaster.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the biggest disasters I've ever seen in terms of QC with Wizards, and that's a bold statement. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's fine. So Rox Face Bender, 1/4 with lifelink, and whenever you gain life, you would gain twice that much. So it works off both lifelink and old school lifelink, like on Loxodon, on Warhammer, and Exalted Angel. So you read the card, and you're like, okay, this is a Pillow 40 card, and you are absolutely right. This card slots into a number of Pillow 40 decks. It is base white, which means you'll see it in Tristani and a number of other things. But this card actually exists in some other niches, and that's kind of why I like it. And you can see in the list of top commanders that I've had up for a little bit, you see Elysia, Sanguine Tribune, which is one of, if not the top vampire tribal commanders. There's Linval the Preserver, which is an angel tribal commander. And so you're reaching out to casuals who want to play tribal there. You can get a little aggressive with something with Evra Halcyon Witness, which allows you to switch your life total with this power toughness to come swinging in, which means that kind of worked with cards like Sarah Avatar and the Ajani Goldmane Ultimate, so you can just continuously make these gigantic creatures and just start swinging for the fences. And it's a little slower, but you get there. And then you can be even a little more aggressive than that and actually play like combo life gain, where you have Oloro at the helm of your deck, and you basically just play into the Sanguine Bond combo. You have Runetail Kitsune Ascendant. When you have 30 more life, you flip it, and then it prevents all damage, and that deck is actually the life gain combo deck. You play Test of Endurance and Felidar Sovereign and anything else that basically just says if you have X amount of life at X point in time, you win the game. And this card becomes this kind of cornerstone there. And because it fills all those niche roles, I like the card as a long-term player in the EDH format. Now, touching on timeline, I want to bring up Jumpstart because that does muck up the picture of this card. If we get the allocation we expect, then the 3 months that I would expect on a turnaround to a player turns probably into 6 or 9, and to buy list it goes from like 12 to closer to 18 or 24. The other thing is rocks are no longer unique to a plane. We kind of broke out of that mold, I think, around M13. They first showed up as a tribe, I believe, on Mirrodin, and were kind of locked there, and we did see... no, Ravnica. That was the first one.
Oh yeah, it was Ravnica. Yeah.
So, like 2 years later, rocks, quote unquote.
Because we had lock. Yeah.
Yeah, the rocks and Loxodon stuff kind of broke out and started crossing planes. Dominaria had rocks initially, and that's where the rhinos became a thing, and then they just kind of spread out. Well, along with the Loxodons. So there is a chance that we see Jumpstart allocation, and we might get it in a standard set. I don't think we'd see it in a supplemental set. I don't think we'd see it in an EDH deck. So, as I mentioned, my short-term timeline would be about 3 months if you're going to want to get out to a player. You can buy in now and probably get out at a profit, but in the neighborhood of like $1 or $2. And I would expect 12 months at a minimum to a buy list if we don't get a Jumpstart or a supplemental reprinting of this in the meantime. Otherwise, if we do, I think it's 24. With the allocation we've seen, the demand that's here, the fact it fits all these niches, I do not expect this card to ever really drop in price unless we get it in a standard set. And this is just another one of those ropes you can buy into and hold forever and just kind of ride it into the sunset. I don't think we're just going to get mono rocks the plane, so...
No. I think it's too niche, and I think, you touched on being an appealing card in casual decks. It is lateral to so many other cards that do the same thing that you want like a critical density of.
Yes.
So this is another way, not to mention it also stacks with other doubling effects. So it's, for Pillow 40 casual stuff, which, we all say casuals drive the market. This is a prime example of something that you want for that purpose. Yeah. Because it's not really a sure thing, but it's as close as you can get.
Yeah. I like looking through the list of commanders, I was only surprised by how aggressive a slant the Runetail deck takes out of all the other decks to get where it's trying to go. I've seen the Oloro deck in person, and anybody I've seen Helmet generally really is tightly tuned to that combo, so Faith Bender isn't quite on the radar because they just want to get to the 2 black enchantments and win the game right there. and Rox slows things down a little too much for an aggressively slanted deck. But I don't think you can build this Runetail deck without it, and this is a very... Quick seems like the wrong word when you're playing a card like True Conviction, but it gets where it needs to go real quick.
Yeah.
Real quick. So, that's my pick for this week.
I like it. I think it's really solid, and I think it touches on a lot of the points that we continually echo as far as, things that indicate, while it might not be 100% a sure shot, it's as close as you can get.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. My pick is Koopa Troopa Flooded Strand.
Hell yeah.
So, the Mario Kart Flooded Strand. Why, you may ask? Well, the price has been fairly stagnant. And while the price has been fairly stagnant, the listings have not. So compared to this time about 6 months ago, we were looking at a 10x compared to what we have on TCG right now. There's currently 29 listings total. And the lowest is $47.99. The very highest is $120. Well, why pick it then? That's easy. If you go over to Card Market, there are 281 listings currently, most of which are below 35 euros. So that is a literal immediate arbitrage for profit. The other interesting thing about this is if you look at Card Kingdom's buy list on this card, if you look at Miniature Market, if you look at Star City, if you look at any of those buy lists, the buy list is $25. And they want 10 plus at all of these places. Now, why that's interesting is because they are just below the threshold where it becomes profitable for them to purchase from MKM and arbitrage themselves, which is something a lot of those vendors do. It is something your GP vendors do. It's a very common practice in that world, and it's an opportunity that a lot of them will seize on, and all of a sudden when shows start up again, you'll see a bunch of these flooded.
Yes.
I think this is a time that, for me personally, I would be going in on this. I've picked up about 15 so far from sellers that had multiples, obviously, because that's the preferred way to do it. Because the less you get from sellers who have multiple, the more you're going to pay in overhead on shipping, everything else. So I think this is a really good pick because it seems to me to have all of the indicators that it will, in short order, be worth significantly more once events start happening. Now, I know what you're saying. Events may never happen, blah, 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 blah. I just don't think that's possible. I think they're going to have events again at some point.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. To point out...
They can't not.
No. Of all the premium versions of Flooded Strands, this is by far the cheapest at 50%-ish of what the other ones are going for. It's impressive that the Judge promo, which is the Onslaught art with, and it's hard to see the DCI logo behind it, being the... I'll call it the cheapest right now at $140 because the Zendikar Rising Expedition starting at $125 seems a little low compared to the original Expedition at $200. But this also has historically a much higher price ceiling than we're seeing right now on this card. Also unique is the fact that it's one of 5. They have not made the other 4 yet. We don't know if we're ever going to get them. So this exists as a unique piece as well. It's listed as random promo or WCN where you look at it, and WCN is a little more, or WPN, sorry, is a little more reliable than miscellaneous because it was given to players at US Nats, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
And European Nats and wherever, But it was primarily for Nats. Which I guess is something they've gotten rid of since everything's on Arena. Maybe that changes in 6 months when they change the Pro League again because they can't get their head out of their ass. Who knows?
Yep. So this was a short-windowed period where the card was given out, never to be given out again, it seems. And because the national competition only happened once, the thought that there would be the other 4 never really occurred. More people were stirred up about this than anything else. So I think it's a great pick because it is the low-hanging fruit of the bunch. You have the historics in front of you in regards to the other ways to, or the other versions of the premium flooded strands to look at and say, okay, this is the window for it. They might have plateaued here. In time, we saw an increase there. And even in a post-COVID world, this does still exist as both a playable piece and a collectible piece.
Yeah.
For that reason. So I like the pick overall, even though it is a little expensive.
Yeah, it is a little on the expensive side, and it is something that you need to jump through a couple of hoops for. Mm-hmm. But it highlights another area of MTG finance that not a lot of people necessarily think about.
Nope.
You know, when you're shopping around for this stuff, it's something where you can say, hey, look, say Magic Corner is at an event. Well, they're from Europe.
Yeah.
You may have a little bit more wiggle room on this stuff in their booth, because they can just go back and buy it
or
for less.
Galactic.
Yeah, Galactus or Galactic, whatever. Yeah. There is the opportunity for that, and I think that's something that's worth exploring when you're able to.
Yeah, and this pick was actually kind of born out of the idea of looking at the cons fetches as a whole. You and I had discussed that for your pick for the week, because we've purposely chosen Polluted Delta several times because it was cyclical. Again, we expected that card to rise, and so we wanted to bring it to your attention. So we were like, all right, we want to look at the cons fetches across the board, and I shot back like, all right, I'm gonna put Flooded Strand in the Discord just as a placeholder for now.
Yeah,
we can leave it as Strand, or would you want me to give Wooded Foothills, because that is kind of the next most expensive one. It goes in most stuff if something like Vrix's Death Shadow isn't pushing up, not Blood Crypt. That's the shock. What is the Bloodstained Mire, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, we can go with either one of those. And you and I were chatting, and I was like, holy hell, what about the Koopa Troopa Flooded Strand?
Yeah,
and it was just like
Koopa Troopa Strand, and that's when I was like, wait, no, that's the one.
Yeah, and it was just this light bulb moment where we both had kind of forgotten that this card existed.
Even existed.
Yeah.
Oops.
And it just became this happy accident of like, well, we were headed in this direction anyway, and this is where our finance acumen brought us. This is the card out of everything that we went through. This is the distilled information to bring, and so it just goes to show that even on the surface, when you're like, okay, this swath of cards we think is going to rise, dig in a little more, peel back the layers, and then you actually arrive at the one answer. Okay, this is more expensive than anything else we had planned to talk on, but the opportunity to make money on this is greater, we believe, than the other options that were layers above.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth noting that with that, you can still make money on the cons fetches.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they're not getting reprinted, obviously, except as expeditions. We know we're not getting them in Modern Horizons 2.
I'm almost 100% on that. You can watch the Zendikar Rising release video on YouTube where they specifically talk about it, but I believe they only call out the Zendikar fetch lands as the enemy fetch lands. They do not make a point to talk about the allied fetch lands.
Yeah.
I don't think they need them, but even if they do, it could still be another art. It's whether you get the Koopa Troopa art or not is...
Yeah. Which traditionally we've seen with promos, they'll sometimes go back to that well. Mm-hmm. But there are numerous times where you can see the promo art is not reused after that promo because enough time has passed that they've decided, well, let's get something else in here. Why not?
Yep.
So. Yeah,
exactly. Or they had other promo art that they liked better, so they go back to a different piece of promo art they had as well. So there are options. We want to look at it that way. But that is going to end our conversation about the Great Reserve List Spike of 2020. There's a chance we'll be back at this again in 2021 or 2022.
2022, yeah. We'll see you then.
Yeah. But, for MTG Cabal Cast, where you can find us on Patreon, Twitter, YouTube, Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I am at Halt I Am Reptar on Twitter. You are
at Thirsty Sizzler.
And we'll catch you guys next week.